Hey everybody, Jamie back again with Heroic Scale Gamers. From buying your first box of minis and paint to being a competent player at the gaming table, we got you covered. Back again with another installment of our Rescue Harlequin series. This time we're going to be doing a character model. We're actually doing a Death Jester. Character models are actually pretty interesting. This is a good opportunity where you get a chance to really flex your hobby skills. Because the characters tend to be your more centerpiece models. If any of you guys have seen some of the others, you can remember what they originally looked like, and we've actually got some finished ones that we can show you. Most of the army's actually complete. This is probably one of the last miniatures we need to finish the project off. So we're gonna do a couple of basic things. So one of the first things we want to do is we're going to actually paint bone on his mask and chest plate because it gives it that whole death look. So we're going to make sure we thin down our paints. We're actually using skeleton bone from the Army Painter War Paints Air range. These are actually really nice because they're going to be super thin down, which is going to allow you to put on a nice thin coat that isn't going to clog up any of the details, but yet it will still give you nice coverage. Now most people would ask, now wouldn't this be something you'd want to spray through an airbrush? Well, that is what it's designed for, but you can do brushwork with it just as well. The nice thing is because it already starts off so super thin, you don't actually have to thin it down before you apply it. So we just want to make sure we get the entire mask covered. And then we're going to go in on the chest piece. And it's actually ridged almost like a rib cage. So by being quite careful, we can get all of the ribs covered without clogging any of the in-betweens with paint. So you can kind of see what I'm going for there. There. All right. Now, what I did was, I'm actually painting two of these at the same time so that we can kind of speed up the process a little bit. So, get the focus in there real good. So now you can see what that coverage looks like once it's dry. It just makes it look like a death mask. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a little bit of Agrax Earthshade mixed with a little bit of Lamy Medium, and we're going to actually brush that into the recesses of the mask, around the eyes, the mouth, and the ridges above the eyes and on the side of the helmet. And then we're also going to do the same thing to the chest piece. And you want to be careful that it doesn't pool too much. So if it does pool up a little bit, you're just going to take a brush and actually move the paint around slightly. Oops, there we go. Might help if I actually have that nice in focus. So that you can actually see what I'm doing. Alright, so we'll see if we can get a good look at what that looks like. So what that's going to do is it's going to darken it up just a little bit so that we can come back in and do some highlights to brighten it up, but keep those recesses nice and dark to give it some definition. Alright, so while that's going on, we're going to start on his cloak. Now, his cloak we're actually going to paint a deep dark brown, and one of the best ways to do that is to actually mix some black with your brown for your base coat. So what I like to do on my palette is get a couple of pulls of black And then directly next to it, I'm going to place a couple of pulls of my dryad bark. That way I can mix them on the palette. You want about a 50-50 mix, because you want to darken it. But with black, if you put too much black into the mixture, it'll darken it so much that you won't actually see the brown. And we still want the brown tone to come into play. Add a little bit of water to it to smooth it out. Beautiful. All right, so now we're going to take this nice base coat that we just produced, and we're going to paint the entirety of his cloak with it. Now, we're not too concerned with being terribly neat with this part of the process, because we can fix anything we need to. It's in the next phases that we're going to want to be a little more careful. We want to make sure we get a nice even coat on the entirety of his jacket. Because we're going to mix a little bit more brown into this as we go up. And eventually we're going to blend it right up to a straight dryad bark on the highest points. Now, there are some painters out there that would tell you this would be an excellent opportunity to wet blend, and I don't disagree with that. Although, honestly, I am not very good at that technique. So I have a cheat for it that we're going to use to come in after the fact and help pull our highlights together to make it look more as a single color. And the light is what shifts the change in color from the high points to the recesses. Alright, so we're going to set that off to dry. I want to do that. If you notice, I'm doing two at the same time here. And I find with character models, because I'm spending a little more time with them, it's a little bit easier to do a couple at a time. Because obviously we're going to spend a little more time on these guys than we would, say, our normal troops. Because these guys are going to stand out. When you set them down on the tabletop, you want people to be able to recognize them as your leaders. So that's why we spend a little extra time. We do a few extra techniques just to accentuate the model and make it look more important. So we're going to go in there and get that brown into place. And just like with anything else, by working on these in tandem, as the other one is drying, then we can get this step done on this one, and hopefully by the time we're done, we can move on to the next step on the other model, and then go back and forth so that we're a little more efficient with our time. Because the last thing you want to do is spend a boatload of time watching paint dry. It's pretty boring. It's almost like watching grass grow. Alright, so you can kind of see what we're going with there. It's very similar. It's really hard to see at the moment, but as we continue through with the process, you'll start to see a difference and the change in the shade. So once again, we're just going to take a little bit more of our dryad bark. We're going to mix that into the color that we mixed there. It's going to brighten it just a little bit. There we go. Alright, and we'll go back to our first guy. So what we want to do is we want to pick the high points. So if you look at the cloak, there's a natural flow to it. So we want the brighter color to show up on the higher points. So we're literally just applying this to the raised areas, but we're going to leave the recess still dark. Now on this side, we want to put just a thin line down the edge so that it looks like the light's catching it. And on this side, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to hit it and we're going to draw it right down the high point. But we're going to leave that darker color in that recess. And then once again on the other side here, we're going to do the same thing. Bring it down. So that when you're finished, you should be able to see a difference in the shades. So it'll be darker in the recess, a little bit lighter on the brighter top edge. So we'll move on back to our second guy, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Now, a lot of people ask, how many of these layers do you need to do? Well, that's going to be personal preference. Basically, you're going to do it until you're happy with the color that you get. And it's going to work out slightly different every single time because you're mixing paints. And unless you are super precise with your mixes, which is not very easy to do, there will always be a little bit of color variation, which is one of the reasons why we're doing these guys together. So if I do them at the same time, then there will be no difference in the shades because I'm applying the paint on both models from the same mix each time, and I'm not having to try to replicate that mix. But it's also one of the reasons that we don't use these types of techniques on our basic troopers, because could you imagine trying to do this 40 times? Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm not saying that you can't, because there are some people who will, and more power to them. But once again, we're just trying to get these miniatures on the table as quickly as we can, to the best of our ability, obviously. All right, and then for the last stage, because I'm only going to do 3 stages here, we're going to do straight dryad bark. I'm going to take a little bit of our dryad bark here, place that on our palette separately. And then we're going to apply this over the same locations, leaving some of the secondary color still showing. Just a little bit of water to that to smooth it out. Perfect. All right. Looking good. So should be able to see pretty good how that color gets slightly brighter as we go to the very, very top, and then stays nice and dark in those deep recesses, which is exactly what we're going for. Go back to our other guy here, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Like I said, leaving just a little bit of that second layer showing. So we're not covering all of it. And that's going to give our gradient in color. So now we have to make sure that this is fully dry before we go on to the next step, because if not, it's going to ruin all the work that we've done. Set that down. We'll check on our other guy here and see if he's fully dry. And it looks like he is. Perfect. So then the next step here is to take some of that same Agrax Earthshade and Lamium medium mix that I used. We're going to do the exact same thing here, is we're going to use this almost like a glaze. So we're going to put a nice thin layer over the entirety of the cloak. And what that's going to do is it's going to naturally blend all three of those layers together, so it's going to look more natural. And it will tint it just slightly, so it is going to darken it just a little bit. But it's going to really make those recesses super dark, and it's going to blend all three layers together. And so what you end up with is almost a blended look without actually having to wet blend your paints together. So as I said, it's kind of like a cheat code. So it gives you the ability to make it look like an advanced technique without actually having to trial and error your way through it. We're going to do the same thing with the second guy. And once again, you want to make sure that it doesn't pool up too much, because if it does, it'll really darken it, and we just want to kind of tint it. So don't be afraid to go in there and move some of that wash around if necessary, or even to remove some of it. And once again, the best way to remove extra wash is to just take a brush and pull it off the model. So you clean it off. Maybe we go over here, we can take a look. Did a pretty good job. It looks like got a little heavy here. So we just draw that brush through and then wipe that off on our palette. Pretty good there, but we're going to probably want to remove a little bit from that recess again. All right, so now while we're waiting for that to dry, we can then flip it over, and we're going to do the same kind of line highlighting that we did with all of the other models on our black inside of the cloak part. So we're going to take a little bit of Eshin Gray, and get that nice and smooth on our palette, and just a bit of water to it. As Duncan Rhodes, one of my favorite painters of all time, likes to say, 2 thin coats. As thin coats are better than thick coats, unless you live in the northeast of the United States where it gets 20 below zero in the wintertime. Then a thick coat might actually be helpful. Alright, so we're just going to line along the edge of the top part of that interior of the cloak piece with our Eshin Gray. And we want to get the inside here, the top of the lapel, and get down there. Yeah, because once again, these line highlights are going to force the perception of depth, which I understand it is still a 3-dimensional model, but the scale is so small, it doesn't look natural. So this actually helps create that. So now we're going to do the exact same thing with number 2. Now, as you can see, I like to steady my hands together in like a triangle. It gives me a lot more control with my movement. It allows me to be a little bit more precise. Now, it's okay if this goes on a little thick because it's easy to fix. We just take a little bit of black and correct it. Boom. Well done. Now, if we're smart, we're going to do the same thing with our weapon because we're going to end up leaving that black. And this is just going to be a naturally easy way to highlight that black. Underneath. Try to keep it nice and clean. Boom. All right. And then I also like to get the top edge of the gun here too. Right there. Ooh. So a lot of people ask, where's the proper place to put highlights? A lot of times what you want to do is you want to get a visual point where you think the light is going to be hitting from, and that's where you're naturally going to put highlights. So you want to kind of figure where the light's going to be hitting. So for example, with this, we're assuming that the light is going to be over here to our right, shining downward in this fashion. So when that happens, that's why we get edges here, here, along here and here, and then we did the same thing with the cloak. Because the light is naturally going to hit those raised areas, and that's where it's going to shine the most, so that's where you're going to get your brightest colors, I guess, is a way of looking at it. Which everyone would say, well, that's kind of weird, because black doesn't really show up as anything lighter. But if you've ever actually really taken a look at something that is black, when a light shines on it, it doesn't look as dark where the light hits it as it would, say, under your arm or at the bottom, especially if you have a big belly like myself. It just creates some natural shadows. And we're just forcing that perspective with the paint. And then make sure we get the same areas. There we go. And then we're going to go in with some Dawnstone, and we're going to then come in with just a thinner line to finish off that highlight. And what I like to do here is I like to make sure I have a nice point on my brush and not as much paint on it. And then we're just going to touch those highest areas. Now, the neater that you can be on this part, the better, because it's going to actually, sorry, the light's a little funky there. The better the finished product will look. idea what we're looking at. Now I got a little thick in one area, and that's actually very easy to fix. Just going to go back in with some of our black. Just going to touch it up, just like that. Very nice. All right, so let me see if I can get that up there so you can see it. So now you can kind of see where those highlights are going to come in to kind of finish off that black area. Now, with the brown, what we're going to want to do is we're actually going to want to take some of our dryad bark and we're going to add just a little bit of bone to it to lighten it up slightly. And we're going to do a highlight very similar. On the cloak. What I'm doing here is I'm actually using the side of the brush to just lightly go over the edge. You want to give it a very fine highlight. We're not trying to do as much with this, because if we do too much, it'll actually stand out and it'll look funny. We just want to give it the subtlest of a fine highlight. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. And really all it is just, it's just a finishing touch. Now the nice thing is that if you're not happy with it the first time through, you can actually add a little bit more bone to it and just go over it a second time, because we're using such small amounts of paint to actually do this. It's actually very easy to brighten it up. The only thing you can't really do to it is you can't really darken it. If you've gone too light the first time out, you're kind of in a rough spot. Like with that one, I'm not sure if that was quite bright enough, so all I've done is go in and add just a little bit more bone, and I'm just going to give it a second touch. Yeah, that's definitely much better. It definitely is going to show off just a little bit more this time. So anyone who's been watching, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on the process and what you think about what the finished product has ended up looking like. So I'll set that down, and now we're going to go through and do the same thing on this second guy. Yeah, that's definitely better. Now, the nice thing about techniques like this is they're completely subjective. So the important thing is that you like what you're putting on the model, because in the end, it's going to be your model. I have always enjoyed painting. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the hobby itself. So I find a lot of times a lot of this stuff that I'm doing is probably more than is necessary, but I always like the way that it turns out, so I don't mind putting in the extra effort. So you can really see how it just kind of brightens up just the edges and gives it a really cool look. All right. 30. All right. So we're gonna go ahead and call this one over. We'll come back with the next stage. We're gonna work on a few other details. We're gonna do some striping on his pants. We're gonna finish up the face mask and the chest plate. And we'll probably do a little bit of work on the base to kind of show you what we do to finish these guys off, and then we'll call them done. So we'll see you next time.